What if I told you that the greatest Christian kingdom in the East collapsed in a single day because of one mistake? History knows many examples of empires that fell over many years, but the Kingdom of Jerusalem burned in the flames of its own pride in an instant. This event turned the world upside down, shook Europe to its core, and gave rise to legends that live on to this day. We are used to seeing knights in shining armor as an invincible force, but the desert does not forgive mistakes, even for the most noble warriors. The sun, the lack of water, and the enemy's ingenious strategy turned an elite army into a crowd of doomed men. There is no room for coincidence in this story, because every step towards disaster was taken consciously and confidently. This is a drama about betrayal, blind faith in one's invulnerability, and how one man managed to unite the East against the West. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how the greatest shrine of the Christian world, the true cross, disappeared forever in the smoke of the ruins. Want to know a secret that will change your perception of knightly honor? For a long time, there was a fragile truce between the Crusaders and the Muslims, which was beneficial to both sides for trade and prosperity. The King of Jerusalem and Sultan Saladin understood that a bad peace was better than a good quarrel and tried to restrain their hot-headed vassals. However, history teaches us that all it takes to start a great war is one madman with power and weapons. In this story, that man was Renaud de Chatillon, owner of the mighty fortress of Kerak, which overlooked the trade routes. He despised any agreements with infidels and considered plunder his legal right. Renaud was a colorful and completely uncontrollable figure, which irritated even his own allies in Jerusalem. He repeatedly broke the king's word by attacking rich caravans traveling from Egypt to Syria through his lands. His actions threatened the security of the entire state, but the weak royal power could not restrain him. Another caravan capture was the spark that ignited the powder keg of the Middle East. Saladin demanded compensation and the return of prisoners, following the letter of the treaty. King Guy de Lusignan tried to force his vassal to obey, but Renaud just laughed in the face of the royal envoys. He declared that he was the master of his own land and would not allow anyone to tell him who to rob. This act of defiance showed the whole world that the King of Jerusalem did not control his own barons. Saladin had the perfect excuse for war, which he had been patiently waiting for many years. Now he was acting not as an aggressor, but as a defender of justice and faith. The Sultan declared jihad, a holy war, calling warriors from all corners of his vast domain to his banner. Endless columns of cavalry and infantry stretched from Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia, ready to punish those who had broken their oaths. Saladin assembled an army, the likes of which these lands had not seen in a very long time. His goal was not simply to punish one baron, but to destroy the entire kingdom of the Crusaders. He understood that the fragmentation of the enemy was his best chance for ultimate victory. At that time, panic and confusion reigned in Jerusalem, as no one had expected such a large-scale invasion. The barons hastily gathered their troops, emptying the garrisons of fortresses and cities in order to create a unified army. It was a risky move because by gathering all the defenders in one place, they left the country defenseless. Key figures of the kingdom gathered for a council, but there was no unity among them. Personal grudges and ambitions overshadowed common sense, which, in the face of imminent danger, was tantamount to death. The conflict between the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, Gerard de Ridford, and Count Raymond of Tripoli reached its peak. Raymond advocated caution, fully understanding Saladin's tactics and the peculiarities of warfare in the desert. Gerard, on the other hand, demanded an immediate attack, accusing all dissenters of cowardice and betrayal of the faith. King Guy of Lusignan, an indecisive man dependent on the opinions of others, wavered between these two extremes. The Crusader army gathered at the springs of Sephoria, where there was plenty of water and pasture for horses. It was the largest army ever fielded by the Kingdom of Jerusalem, numbering about 20,000 men. Here were the best knights, infantrymen, and mercenaries, ready to fight for the Holy Sepulchre. It seemed that such power could crush any enemy in open battle. However, Saladin had no intention of attacking them on their advantageous positions. The Sultan laid siege to the city of Tiberias, where Count Raymond's wife was located, hoping to lure the Crusaders out of their safe camp. It was a classic trap, designed to exploit the enemy's code of honor and emotions. Raymond, despite the danger to his family, begged the king not to give in to provocation. He said that the city could be retaken, but the loss of the army would spell the end of the entire kingdom. Raymond's words sounded reasonable, and at first the king was inclined to stay at the springs. But during the night, the situation changed when the Grand Master of the Knights Templar came to the king's tent. He convinced Guy that inaction would be seen as shame and weakness, unworthy of a ruler. In the morning, the fateful order was given to march to the aid of besieged Tiberias. This order became a death sentence for thousands of people who were still unaware of their fate. The army left the life-giving springs and marched into the sun-scorched desert. We are very interested to hear your opinion. What do you think about the king's decision? Was it worth risking everything for honor, or should he have listened to the voice of reason? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about how nature becomes the most merciless enemy, before which even steel blades pale in comparison? The decision to leave fortified Sepphoris was made, and a huge Christian column, knights, infantry, wagons, standard-bearers, moved eastward under the blinding July sun. On the map, the distance to Tiberias seemed ridiculous. 30 kilometers, a day's march for a seasoned army. But the Galilean summer was not a journey, but a death sentence if approached without respect. The world around them turned into an endless hot plate, where the air shimmered with heat, and every stone burned the soles of their feet. The landscape, parched and merciless, offered no shade, no sip of moisture, not even the illusion of salvation. As soon as the army moved away from the last sources of water, thin, fast rings of Muslim cavalry began to close in around it. These were not frontal attacks, but a hunt. Saladin's light horsemen followed the flanks, swooped down on the column, and disappeared, showering it with a hail of arrows. The arrowheads glinted in the sunlight like pieces of hot metal. The Crusaders, encased in heavy chain-mail helmets and breastplates, suffered more from the heat than from the enemy's blows. The iron heated up to such an extent that it seemed as if the armor was melting on their bodies. Some warriors could smell their own skin, as if the metal was burning them from the inside. The horses, on which the strength of the knights depended, quickly became exhausted without water. Their breathing became sharp and painful, and their eyes clouded over with salt and dust. The infantrymen, covered in dust from head to toe, coughed, choked, and began to fall behind. Every breath felt as if the air were a mixture of ash and sand. Saladin, learning of the departure of Guy de Lusignan's army, gave a simple but ingenious order. Do not engage in serious combat. Instead, wear them down, exhaust them, and fray their nerves. His archers circled the perimeter like wolves around a weakened bull. As soon as the knights tried to counterattack, the horsemen disappeared, only to reappear again, like water. Each such attack took away strength and men. The sun was covered by a dusty veil, and the air became so thick that it seemed you could cut it with a knife. Thirst tormented the warriors after only a few hours of travel. The leather waterskins were empty, and what little remained in the wagons was guarded like a sacred treasure. King Guy led his army slowly and in formation, not allowing the enemy to break the column and cut off the wagons. The rearguard, the Templars and Hospitallers, suffered constant attacks. They had to constantly stop, raise their shields, repel assaults, and reform their ranks. This slowed down the entire march, turning it into an exhausting agony. By midday, it became clear that they would not reach Tiberias before sunset. The heat was killing faster than the swords. Raymond of Tripoli, who led the vanguard, realized that they were being led into a trap. He tried to change course and break through to the springs near the village of Hattin. But communication between the parts of the army had been severed. Messengers got lost, were delayed, and brought orders that contradicted previous ones. The commanders were acting blindly, and the soldiers were on the verge of exhaustion. Even experienced knights felt their hands trembling from dehydration. As the sun began to set on the horizon, the army stopped on a bare plateau, just a few kilometers from the water they could no longer reach. People simply fell onto the rocks, unable to pull off their scorching armor. Some chainmail literally had to be torn from their skin. There was no water at all. The only hope was that it would get easier at night. But even that hope faded like a mirage. Saladin surrounded the Crusaders with a tight ring, completely blocking their escape routes. Watchfires burned around the perimeter, like thousands of eyes watching the doomed. Night fell like a sentence. The men did not sleep. Their strength had left them, and fear was sapping what remained of their courage. The infantrymen fell asleep at their posts. The knights sat with their heads bowed, like old men who had lost their will. The night before the execution was approaching. The Crusaders found themselves locked in on bare ground, without water, without strength, surrounded by a numerically superior enemy. The king's strategic mistake became obvious to everyone, from the baron to the last servant in the camp. They had walked into the jaws of death, lured there, in essence, by the heat. Now it was no longer a question of victory or honor, only survival. But surviving without water, with broken discipline and complete encirclement, was almost impossible. Saladin had won the battle before a single sword had been raised. This story is a lesson for all generations. Ignoring temperature, terrain, and climate turns even the strongest army into a column of suicide bombers. No amount of valor can replace water in the desert. In the next chapter, you will learn how the Sultan used psychological terror to finally break the spirit of the Crusaders. What I am about to show you is banned in 12 countries as a method of warfare, but at that time it was the norm. The night did not bring the desired coolness and rest to the exhausted Crusader army. Saladin ordered his soldiers to position themselves around the Christian camp so close that their voices could be heard. The Muslims lit hundreds of fires, creating the illusion of an endless sea of fire surrounding the small island of the doomed. The noise, prayers, and battle cries of the Saracens kept the Christians from closing their eyes for a moment. Psychological pressure was part of the Sultan's plan to finally break the enemy's will. His soldiers demonstratively poured water from their wineskins onto the ground, in full view of the Crusaders dying of thirst. The sound of flowing water was more terrifying than any weapon, causing fits of madness in those who had not drunk for a day. The smell of roasted meat and fresh bread coming from the enemy's fires tormented the hungry soldiers. Inside the Crusaders' camp, there was an atmosphere of doom and quiet horror. People prayed, confessed, and wrote farewell notes, realizing that dawn might be their last. Discipline began to crack at the seams. Soldiers fought over the last drops of rotten water in their flasks. Knights tried to calm their horses, which were going mad from thirst and lack of food. The royal tent became the center of endless disputes and mutual accusations between the commanders. Raymond reproached the king for his stupidity, while Gerard de Ridford insisted on a morning attack as the only chance. Guy de Lusignan sat silently, crushed by the burden of responsibility for the decision that had been made. No one believed in victory anymore, hoping only for a miracle or a dignified death. Saladin's archers continued to fire on the camp even in the darkness, shooting arrows into the thick of the crowd. The cries of the wounded mingled with the neighing of horses and the monotonous hum of the enemy troops. Sleep was impossible, rest was unattainable, and every hour of that night took away the last of their strength. Fatigue accumulated, turning the warriors into sluggish zombies. Saladin, however, understood perfectly well that time was on his side and did not rush to launch an assault. He gave his men the opportunity to rest and recharge their batteries, replacing the troops on the front line. His army was full of determination and energy, seeing the helplessness of the hated invaders. Confidence in victory inspired the Muslim warriors. By dawn, it was clear that the Crusaders were completely demoralized and physically exhausted. Many infantrymen could no longer lift their shields, and the knights struggled to climb into their saddles. But the most terrible test was yet to come when the sun rose. The night on the plain of Hattin was a turning point when the army ceased to be an organized force. Fear and deprivation destroyed the hierarchy and faith in the command. People felt betrayed by their leaders. It was a night when hope died completely, giving way to despair. Saladin managed to defeat the spirit of the enemy without engaging in direct contact. Don't forget to like if you are interested in the history of military art. What if I told you that the wind can kill far more effectively than a sword? The morning of July 4th, 1187, which could have been the beginning of a long-awaited salvation, brought the Crusaders only a new, even more agonizing circle of hell. When the first rays of the sun broke through the horizon, the heat descended on the plateau with relentless fury, heavy, suffocating, almost tangible, like red-hot iron thrown over their shoulders. But Saladin had prepared something worse than any weapon for his enemy. He knew this land, felt its breath and the familiar summer winds. He understood that nature itself was ready to become an ally, if only it were pushed in the right direction. Around the Crusaders' camp swayed tall, sun-scorched grass mixed with dry, brittle bushes, an ideal, deadly canvas for those who could think beyond the confines of conventional warfare. On his orders, the soldiers set fire to the vegetation on the windward side. The wind, born on the eastern slopes, caught the fire, fanned it, and drove it in a dense, roaring wall straight at the Christian positions. But even more terrifying than the flames was the smoke. Thick, tarry, acrid, like death itself. It swirled above the ground, enveloping everything around it in a grey-black blanket, turning the morning into a nightmarish, suffocating night. The smoke stung the eyes, burned the throat, and scorched the lungs as if red-hot needles were being driven into them. People coughed, choked, fell to their knees, tried to breathe through their sleeves, through rags, but this only prolonged their agony. Visibility disappeared completely. Officers shouted orders, but no one could orient themselves by sound or sight anymore. Even the sun became just a dim spot somewhere overhead. The infantry, already exhausted by thirst, heat, and a sleepless night, lost their composure. The ranks faltered, and people gathered into shapeless crowds like a herd driven into a fiery trap. The heat of the fire mingled with the heat of the sun and the heat of thousands of bodies and animals. The temperature inside the formation became unbearable, and people fell unconscious, some from suffocation, others from heat stroke. Under the cover of this hellish air, Muslim archers approached almost silently, invisibly, like shadows themselves. Arrows began to rain down on the Crusader knights so thickly and densely that it seemed as if the air was cut by black veins. The knights could see neither the enemy nor the trajectory of the shots. They raised their shields, but the arrows found gaps, striking helmets, inexperienced hands, unprotected necks, and horses, which, maddened, reared up and crushed their own riders. The king desperately tried to restore order, to line up his army, to force it to move at least to Lake Tiberias, where there was life-saving water. But the infantry, maddened, blinded, burned by smoke, no longer listened. Instead of moving in an organized manner, they rushed to the western slopes, where there was less fire. This flight, this desperate, senseless quest for salvation, destroyed the formation and left the knights, the king's last fighting force, without cover. Smoke, ash, and heat separated the Crusaders into isolated pockets of people who could not hear or see each other, who did not understand what was happening around them. The commanders lost control of their troops. Each man now fought not so much against the enemy as against the suffocating air, the heat, and his own fear. From the hill, Saladin watched the events unfold, calmly, intently, like a master who sees his plan being carried out with precision, down to the smallest detail. He used everything the earth had given him in the battle: the scorching sun, the hot wind, fire, and dry ground. The Crusaders were now fighting not against an army. They were fighting against nature itself, as if the earth itself had rejected them. Attempts to break through the wall of fire ended in instant death under a hail of arrows. The army was trapped like a beast in a cage, and the cage was only getting tighter. The smoke hid the true scale of the disaster, but the moans, screams, crackling of the fire, and gasping breaths of the dying spoke louder than any words. The fire was the final nail in the coffin of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. It destroyed everything the Crusaders had left: order, discipline, hope. And in the next chapter, you will see how the greatest shrine of Christianity, for which 2 generations of knights shed their blood, will find itself at the heart of a bloody massacre. Without exaggeration, the area where the final drama unfolded looked like the setting for the end of the world. The horns of Hattin are the twin peaks of an extinct volcano towering over a scorched plateau. It was against these rocks that the remnants of the Christian army huddled in a last desperate attempt at defense. The royal tent was pitched at the foot of one of the hills, becoming a center of attraction for all the survivors. The infantry, abandoning the knights, tried to gain a foothold at the very top of the northern horn. However, without the support of the cavalry, they were easy prey for Saladin's Mamluks. The Muslims stormed the heights, throwing the defenders off the rocks and slaughtering those who tried to surrender. The cries from the summit reached the king, but he could no longer help his men. Down in the valley, the knights gathered around the king and the Holy Cross. They were elite warriors, the best fighters of their time, but they were unable to maneuver. Horses were falling from exhaustion, and many knights had to fight on foot. Their heavy armor, which had previously been an advantage, was now a burden. Saladin ordered his men to close in, but not to engage in hand-to-hand combat with the heavy cavalry until they were completely exhausted. His tactic was simple: shoot the horses, turning the knights into clumsy infantrymen. Hundreds of thousands of arrows were fired that day, darkening the sky. The ground was studded with shafts like bristles. Despite their dire situation, the Crusaders fought with the fury of the doomed, displaying miracles of personal heroism. They made sorties, trying to break through to the Sultan and kill him in order to decapitate the enemy army. One such attack almost achieved its goal, forcing Saladin himself to draw his sword. But the numerical superiority of the Muslims was overwhelming. In the center of this chaos stood the true cross, a huge golden reliquary decorated with precious stones. The Bishop of Acre held it, encouraging the warriors and promising heavenly salvation to those who fell in battle. For the knights, protecting this shrine was more important than their own lives. However, the defenders' strength was melting away with every minute under the scorching sun and the enemy's blows. The ring around the royal tent was getting smaller and smaller, shrinking like shagreen leather. The corpses of men and horses formed a rampart behind which the last defenders took cover. The air was thick with the smell of blood, smoke, and sweat, creating an unbearable atmosphere. The sounds of battle, the clang of metal, screams, moans, merged into a single roar of death. There was no hope of salvation. All that remained was to sell one's life for as much as possible. The Horns of Hattin became the grave of the cream of European knighthood. Here, on these rocks, the history of the First Kingdom of Jerusalem came to an end. But the fate of the most important relic was even more terrible. Are you ready for the shocking truth about how the main symbol of faith collapsed? The battle culminated when Muslim troops broke through to the center of the Crusaders' defenses. The Bishop of Acre, carrying the life-giving cross, was killed by an arrow, and the shrine nearly fell to the ground. Another priest caught it, but the relic's days in Christian hands were numbered. The defenders, wounded and exhausted, could no longer hold back the onslaught of the attackers. The capture of the true cross became the main goal of Saladin's army, a symbol of complete and final victory over the infidels. The Mamluks rushed toward the golden reliquary, disregarding their losses as if possessed. The knights surrounding the cross fell one after another, forming a mountain of bodies around it. When the last defender was defeated, the Muslims took possession of the relic. The news of the capture of the cross instantly spread across the battlefield, causing diametrically opposite reactions from both sides. For the Muslims, it was a sign of divine favor and the triumph of Islam. Thousands of voices cried out in unison, "Allahu Akbar!" and this cry drowned out the noise of battle. For the Crusaders, however, the loss of the cross was a terrible blow that broke their spirit once and for all. They believed that the relic guaranteed them divine protection and victory. Seeing their enemies carry away their main relic, many threw down their weapons and fell to their knees in despair. It was not just a military defeat, it was the collapse of their worldview. Saladin ordered the captured cross to be carried before the ranks of his army, but upside down. It was an act of the greatest humiliation for the Christian faith, and a demonstration of the Sultan's power. The relic was sent to Damascus, where it was carried through the streets to the jeers of the crowd. The fate of the wooden part of the cross itself is lost in the mists of history. Some say it was kept in the Sultan's treasury, others say it was destroyed. But for the Christian world, it was lost forever, becoming a symbol of the greatest tragedy. The capture of the cross had enormous psychological significance for the whole of Europe. When the news reached Rome, Pope Urban III, according to legend, died of grief. This event was the impetus for the start of the Third Crusade. The Battle of Hattin was not just a defeat of an army, it was the destruction of the spiritual core of the kingdom. Without the cross and without an army, Jerusalem was doomed. But what was the fate of those who led the kingdom to its demise? King Guy and his barons were taken prisoner, awaiting their fate. In the next chapter, you will learn how Saladin dealt with the main culprits of the war. The victory was complete, and Saladin settled in his luxurious tent to accept the surrender of the enemy leaders. Everyone standing nearby understood him, for until that day he had slowly walked a long path of military campaigns, diplomacy, and difficult decisions. The enemy commanders now approached him as the man who would determine their fate. Each step towards the tent became a symbol of their defeat and the end of the kingdom of Jerusalem's power. The atmosphere was tense, but at that moment, everyone already knew that the outcome of the battle could not be changed. King Guy de Lusignan, his brother Armory, Renaud de Chatillon, and the master of the Knights Templar were brought before the Sultan. They were exhausted from the journey and the heat. Their clothes were torn and covered in dust, and their faces were gaunt from thirst. Until recently, these men had commanded an entire army, but now they were prisoners without any hope. Their silence spoke louder than words, because everyone understood that only the will of the victor lay ahead. All they could do was wait humbly for the Sultan to decide their fate. It was a meeting between the victor, who had strived for this day his entire life, and the vanquished, who had lost everything. Saladin stood confidently, demonstrating his composure after a long campaign. The captives looked up at him, realizing that the difference between their positions was now enormous. The smell of sweat, dust, and blood hung in the air. reminding everyone present of the price that had been paid for this victory. No one doubted that this moment would go down in history. Saladin greeted King Guy with the courtesy befitting a monarch and offered him a bowl of ice-cold rose water. This gesture was a sign of high respect, which had a profound meaning in the East. Guy stared at the cup for a long time before taking his first sip, as if checking to see if it was a vision caused by fatigue. When the cold water touched his lips, he felt a relief he had not experienced in a long time. After that, he slowly passed the cup to Renaud de Chatillon, who was standing nearby. But Saladin stopped him, uttering his famous words, "I did not give him to drink." These words were spoken firmly, so that many of the Sultan's entourage even raised their heads. Everyone immediately understood that this man was now outlawed and no longer protected by mercy. The silence that followed these words was even heavier than the announcement of his fate itself. Renaud instantly understood that his fate was practically sealed. With this phrase, the Sultan emphasized that his guarantees of safety did not extend to Renaud. He reminded the Baron of his attacks on caravans, his violation of truces, and his blasphemous words about the Prophet Muhammad. These actions had poisoned relations between Muslims and Crusaders for many years, causing outbreaks of new wars. Even now, in captivity, Renaud did not apologize and showed the same audacity as always. He replied as if everything that had happened was a matter of course for rulers. Renaud told the Sultan that kings always act this way, as if trying to justify their cruelty with their policies. His words sounded like a challenge, not an attempt to save his life. Saladin's warriors were struck by his stubbornness and defiance, even in the face of death. Some believed that he could have softened the Sultan's anger with a simple apology. But Renaud preferred to die as he had lived, without admitting his guilt. Saladin, renowned for his nobility, was relentless this time. He drew his sword with the determination of a man who was forced to take justice into his own hands. According to various sources, he either struck a blow, cutting off Renaud's hand, or struck his head directly. The Sultan's warriors immediately finished off the fallen baron so that everything would end quickly. His body was immediately dragged outside the tent so as not to desecrate the place of negotiations. King Guy, watching this, trembled all over because he realized how close death was to him. For him, this scene was a reminder of his complete dependence on Saladin's will. He felt fear grip his soul, for no one had expected the Sultan to be capable of killing a prisoner with his own hands. Even the strong warriors beside him looked shocked. Guy prayed silently that Saladin would not decide to do the same to him. But the Sultan reassured him with the words, "Kings do not kill kings." This phrase sounded almost gentle against the backdrop of the execution that had just taken place. Guy realized that his life had been spared not because he deserved it, but out of respect for his royal title. Saladin decided to send him to Damascus, where he would live in honorable captivity, posing no threat. This was a striking example of how differently the Sultan treated his enemies, guided by his faith and personal honor. This mercy towards a weak king contrasted sharply with his cruelty towards an enemy he considered incorrigible. Saladin saw no point in spilling more blood if the enemy was already completely disarmed. He realized that his cruelty towards Renaud was a lesson to anyone who would ever break the peace. Guy was part of a political game, not a personal enemy of the faith. That is why he was given a chance at life. The fate of the Knights Templar and Hospitaller was much bleaker. Saladin considered them fanatics who would never give up the fight and would always raise their swords. He remembered many episodes when they went into battle to the end, refusing any negotiations. For the Sultan, they posed a threat comparable to an entire army. Therefore, he decided that they could not be left alive. A death sentence was passed on nearly 200 captured knights, and each of them understood that it was impossible to change this. When they were led out, they stood silently, maintaining their usual discipline. None of them asked for mercy because they knew it was unworthy of their rank. They prepared to meet their end, as they had met battle, with prayer and steadfastness. For Saladin, their execution was an important step for the security of future generations. After the defeat at Hattin, the Kingdom of Jerusalem no longer had an army. The garrisons of the cities were empty, as all the men had gone on campaign and were either dead or captured. The country lay open before Saladin, and he began his triumphal march. Cities surrendered one after another, often without a fight, opening their gates to the victor. Acre, Jaffa, Beirut, Sidon. The richest ports on the coast came under the Sultan's rule. Saladin showed mercy to those who surrendered, allowing Christians to leave with their property or stay and pay a tax. It was a wise policy that preserved infrastructure and avoided unnecessary casualties. The fame of his generosity preceded his army. Only a few fortresses, such as Tyre, where Conrad of Montferrat led the defense, offered resistance. But Saladin did not waste time on long sieges. His main goal was Jerusalem. He wanted to return the city to Islam, to wash away the shame of its capture by the Crusaders 88 years earlier. Jerusalem was overflowing with refugees from all over the country, but there was no one to defend it. The defense was led by Balian of Ibelin, a knight who happened to be in the city. He managed to organize the inhabitants, knighting all men of noble birth, even teenagers. But this was a militia, not a professional army. Saladin approached the walls of the Holy City in September 1187. He did not want to destroy the holy sites and offered generous terms of surrender, but the defenders refused. A siege began, in which the Muslims used catapults and tunnels to destroy the walls. Despite desperate resistance, it became clear that the fall of the city was only a matter of time. Balian d'Ibelin went to negotiate with the Sultan, threatening to destroy the Muslim shrines of the city and kill their families if they were not allowed to leave. Saladin, wanting to keep the city intact, agreed to a ransom. On October 2nd, 1187, on the anniversary of the Prophet Muhammad's ascension to heaven, Saladin entered Jerusalem. The crosses were removed from the domes of the mosques, and the ringing of bells ceased, giving way to the call of the muezzin. But there was no massacre like the one carried out by the Crusaders in 1099. Christians were allowed to buy their freedom and leave for the coast. Those who had no money were ransomed by Saladin himself and his brother. This act of humanism amazed contemporaries and became legendary. The fall of Jerusalem marked the end of the Crusaders' dominance in the East. It was a triumph for Saladin, who had reached the height of his power and glory. But the story did not end there, as Europe could not accept the loss of the Holy Sepulchre. Hattin was the prologue to new, even larger wars. The Battle of Hattin had such consequences that its echoes were felt for many centuries to come. It became a turning point, not only in the military history of the Crusades, but also in the perception of the West and East by each other. For the first time, the Crusader armies saw that their familiar methods of combat were useless under the scorching sun and in conditions of water shortage. And although many knights considered themselves invincible, reality turned out to be much harsher than their ideas of glory. This catastrophe clearly demonstrated that Western armies were almost defenseless against the sophisticated Eastern tactics, where mobility, endurance, and the ability to strike the enemy from a distance played a major role. The Crusaders realized that the simple power of the sword, heavy armor, and religious fervor were not enough to hold on to what had already been conquered. To survive in a foreign land, it was necessary to be able to negotiate, use cunning, and take into account every local wind. The loss of Jerusalem was a blow to Europe, comparable to what the Roman Empire had once experienced during the invasion of the barbarians. The news spread so quickly throughout the kingdoms that chroniclers could barely keep up with recording the new reactions of the monarchs. People in cities and villages saw this tragedy as a sign that fate itself had turned away from the Christian world. It was this fear that forced kings to put aside internal conflicts for the sake of a campaign that seemed to be the business of all Europe. The kings of England, France, and Germany almost simultaneously vowed to return to the Holy Land, and their vows marked the beginning of the Third Crusade. Europe saw a rare unity, although it was dictated not so much by politics as by concern for the future of the faith. This campaign saw a confrontation that became legendary when Richard the Lionheart attempted to challenge Saladin himself. But even his talent as a commander and personal bravery did not change the outcome. Even Richard, who was famous for his victories and daring maneuvers, was unable to recapture Jerusalem, and this served as a clear reminder of how significant Saladin's victory at Hattin had been. The Christian army was never able to regain its former power. The battle permanently changed the balance of power, and this change was felt throughout the following century. For the Muslim world, Hattin became a symbol that scattered lands could unite in the face of a common threat. Saladin's victory showed that steadfastness and faith could withstand even the most dangerous opponents. People saw him as an example of a ruler who not only knew how to fight, but also strove for justice and order. His image became part of the cultural memory of the East. Saladin became the ideal ruler, whose fame extended far beyond his own domain. He was respected even by some Europeans who admired his mercy and nobility. The chronicles of the time often noted that he behaved like a true knight, even when fighting against those he considered enemies of his faith. His name became a symbol of liberation and wisdom. Meanwhile, the Kingdom of Jerusalem continued to exist, but it was no longer the powerful state that once dreamed of establishing control over the entire Holy Land. It had become a fragile structure, dependent on the help of European powers and luck in diplomacy. The kingdom lost not only its capital, but also the confidence that had once inspired its knights to go on long campaigns. Without Jerusalem, the kingdom retreated to the coast, trying to hold on to at least the ports and fortresses from which reinforcements could be obtained. But life there was difficult, as every inch of land near the cities could be disputed. The state seemed to live in anticipation of the next blow, realizing that its fate was already sealed. Hattin became a classic example of how knowledge of the terrain and the ability to manage resources can determine the outcome of a battle. Military academies still consider this battle a lesson that victory rarely depends solely on the number or quality of weapons. Logistics, morale, and competent planning are no less important than the strength of the army. It was the lack of water and the wrong choice of route that caused the death of almost the entire army. The mistake in choosing the route to the source of the Creuson cost the Crusader states much more than just defeat on the battlefield. It led to the collapse of a political system that had existed for almost a century. The chronicles note that many knights did not even understand how quickly it all happened because the heat of battle and thirst deprived them of their ability to make decisions. The story of the cross lost at Hattin still raises many questions and controversies. This relic was considered one of the most sacred to Christians, and its disappearance shocked everyone who believed in its power. People thought that the cross would always be with them and protect them, but it ended up in the hands of the victors. This made many people think that the true power of faith is not always connected with material symbols. The loss of the cross reminded Christians that spiritual fortitude does not depend on the possession of sacred objects. It intensified disappointment and became a painful reminder of how quickly what seems eternal can disappear. Many theologians of the time wondered whether this loss was a test or a warning. Today, the battlefield of Hattin is a quiet national park where the wind blows through the dry grass. The horns of Hattin still tower over the landscape, silent witnesses to the tragedy. Tourists rarely visit here, preferring more famous biblical sites. But it was here that the fate of the Holy Land was decided. Archaeologists still find arrowheads and fragments of armor in the ground. The earth seems to preserve the memory of that terrible day when it was soaked with blood. These finds help to reconstruct the details of the battle and confirm the descriptions of chroniclers. The image of Saladin that emerged after Hattin influenced European culture. He became a hero of chivalric novels, a noble pagan who was held up as an example to Christian kings. Dante even placed him in limbo, a place for virtuous non-Christians, in his Divine Comedy. Hattin also became a lesson in the importance of leadership. Saladin managed to unite disparate tribes and clans for a single purpose. Guy de Lusignan could not even keep his own vassals in line. The difference in leadership was fatal. This story teaches us that fanaticism is blind, while wisdom is cautious. Those who called for an immediate attack in the name of God led everyone to their doom. Those who called for caution were proven right, but were powerless to prevent the catastrophe. The modern Middle East still bears the mark of those events. The region's borders, religions, and conflicts have their roots in that distant era. Understanding the history of Hattin is the key to understanding many contemporary processes. We must not forget that behind the dry lines of textbooks there are real people. People who wanted to drink, feared death, and hoped for salvation. Their tragedy should serve as a reminder of the price of war. The Battle of Hattin is not just a page in the past, it is a mirror in which we can see our own vices. Ambition, intolerance, and stupidity still rule the world, and they still lead to disaster. May the memory of those who perished under the scorching sun of Galilee serve as a warning to future generations. Peace is fragile, and it is easier to destroy than to build. We have traveled with you from the sources of Sepphoris to the walls of Jerusalem, tracing the chronicle of one of the most dramatic disasters in history. The Battle of Hattin showed how arrogance and discord can destroy even the strongest army. Saladin won not because his soldiers were braver, but because he thought, planned, and exploited his enemies' mistakes. The loss of the true cross became a symbol of the powerlessness of faith without reason. Do you think the Crusaders had any chance of avoiding this defeat, or was the outcome predetermined by their internal weaknesses? Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories about the great battles of the past.